The ancient vessel loomed against the setting sun, its wooden skeleton weathered by decades of salt and neglect. Barnacles crawled up its hull like memories refusing to be forgotten. Local legends whispered of treasures hidden in its depths, but wiser folk spoke of darker things, secrets that should remain buried beneath rotting planks and rusted chains. 17-year-old Marcus had heard all the stories since childhood, but today, armed with nothing but a flashlight and his boundless curiosity, he finally gathered the courage to venture inside. What he couldn't know was that the ship had been waiting for him. Not just any visitor, but someone specific, someone whose blood carried echoes of a past tied to these very timbers. As he descended into the captain's quarters, his flashlight beam caught something gleaming in the shadows, something that shouldn't still exist. The morning sun cast long shadows across Marcus Blackwood's bedroom as he carefully placed the old family photo album back on his shelf. 17 years in Port Haven had taught him to rise with the fishermen. Even on school days, he traced his fingers over a faded photograph of his great-grandfather standing proudly beside a weathered fishing vessel, the same determined eyes that stared back at him. In the mirror, Marcus. "Breakfast getting cold," his father called from downstairs, voice gruff from years of shouting over crashing waves and howling winds. Port Haven clung to the coastline like barnacles to a ship's hull, stubborn, resilient and unchanged by time. Tourism sustained the town now, but fishing had built it, a fact Marcus's father never let him forget. Their modest two-story home overlooked the harbor, where the abandoned pirate ship, locally known as the Siren's Call, had been moored for decades. "Coming," Marcus replied, grabbing his backpack and the notebook filled with sketches of the infamous vessel. Downstairs, his father James sat reading the local newspaper, a ritual as predictable as the tides. A practical man with calloused hands and salt and pepper hair, he'd taken over the family fishing business after Marcus's mother passed away 10 years ago. "School project coming along?" James asked without looking up. "It's fine," Marcus replied, reaching for toast. The project was his excuse for researching the ship, something his father discouraged with surprising intensity. "Your grandfather's stopping by later," James added. "Says he has something to show you." Marcus perked up. Grandpa Eddie was the only one who encouraged his fascination with maritime history. At 82, Eddie Blackwood remembered when the mysterious ship first appeared in their waters, towed in for what was supposed to be a brief restoration before becoming a museum attraction. The funding had dried up, leaving the vessel to decay at the edge of their harbor, simultaneously eyesore and attraction. After breakfast, Marcus headed toward Port Haven High, taking the scenic route along the harbor. The morning fog was lifting, revealing the Siren's Call in all its dilapidated glory. Even in ruin, the ship commanded respect, a three-masted trading vessel with ornate carvings still visible beneath years of weathering. Obsessing again, Ellie Martinez appeared beside him, her dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, camera hanging around her neck. As the editor of the school paper, she documented everything in Port Haven worth noting, which wasn't much. "Just looking," Marcus defended. "That's what addicts say before relapse," she teased. "Seriously though, I got those books you wanted from my cousin at the university library." Ellie reached into her bag and handed him 2 worn volumes on maritime superstitions and nautical archaeology. She was the only person who took his interest seriously besides his grandfather. "Miss Patterson mentioned there are town records about the ship," Marcus said as they walked, "dating back to when it first arrived. The old town archivist. Good luck with that. She guards those files like a dragon hoarding gold." "She likes me," Marcus shrugged. "Says I remind her of my grandfather." At school, Marcus endured classes while sketching the ship in his notebook margins. History was his only engaging subject, especially when Mr. Holden discussed naval warfare and exploration. After the final bell, Marcus headed to the small town library where Miss Patterson presided over Port Haven's archives. The elderly woman looked up from her desk, spectacles perched on her nose. "Young Mr. Blackwood," She greeted him warmly. "Come to research your obsession again?" "If you don't mind," he smiled. "Specifically about when it arrived." She studied him thoughtfully before disappearing into the back room, returning with a dusty file box. "Newspaper clippings, harbor master logs and town council minutes," she explained. "But be careful what you go looking for, Marcus. Some stories in this town stay buried for good reasons." That evening, as twilight painted the harbor in watercolor hues, Marcus sat with his grandfather on their back porch, overlooking the water. "Your father says you're still fixated on that old wreck," Eddie said, pulling out a small, leather-bound book from his jacket. "Maybe this will help explain why it matters." The book was a personal journal, the name Edward Blackwood Sr. inscribed inside. "My father's notes," Eddie explained. "Your great-grandfather served in the Navy, but his father before him, your great-great-grandfather, was something else entirely. A sailor with stories too wild to believe." He tapped the journal meaningfully. "Our family and that ship. We have history, boy. Some might call it fate." Marcus's fingers trembled slightly as he accepted the journal, feeling the weight of generations and untold secrets pressing into his palms. Port Haven's relationship with the Siren's Call was complicated at best. For the tourism board, the decrepit vessel was a marketable curiosity. Authentic pirate history proclaimed brochures in the visitor center. For older residents, it was an eyesore better towed out to sea and sunk. But for a select few, those whose families stretched back generations in Port Haven, the ship was something to be feared. 3 disappearances in 1967, 2 more in '82. Miss Patterson explained, pointing to yellowed newspaper clippings spread across the archive table, all connected to unauthorized visits to that ship. Marcus leaned closer, studying a faded photograph of a search party combing the harbor. "Were they ever found?" "Only one," she said quietly. "Jacob Miller, washed up 3 miles down the coast. The medical examiner ruled it drowning." "But what?" Miss Patterson removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "My sister worked at the hospital then. She said his lungs contained no water, yet his body was preserved somehow, like he'd been pickled in salt." The old town archives occupied the library basement, a room smelling of dust and forgotten things. Shelves of record books and map tubes reached to the ceiling. At the center, a massive oak table held the materials Paul Patterson had retrieved for Marcus: harbor records, newspaper clippings, and town council minutes spanning decades. "Mayor Collins wants to restore it again," Marcus noted, reading a recent council proposal. "Make it a proper tourist attraction." "Same proposal every 5 years, Patterson scoffed. "Always the same result: funding disappears, accidents happen, interest wanes." She tapped a gnarled finger on a council record from 1988. "Your grandfather spoke quite forcefully against the last attempt." Marcus recalled his earliest memory of the ship. He must have been 6, holding his grandfather's hand as they stood on the harbor walk. "Never set foot on her, Marcus," Grandpa Eddie had warned, his usual gentle voice stern. "That ship's got hungry bones." Child Marcus had nightmares for weeks about skeletons rising from splintered wood. "There was a storm last month," Marcus said, changing topics. "Dad said it shifted the ship. Worst in 30 years, Miss Patterson nodded. Broke the moorings on the starboard side. Harbor master said it pivoted almost 45 degrees. She gave him a sharp look. Made it easier to access from the old pier, I imagine. Marcus felt his cheeks flush. "I wouldn't know." "Of course not," she replied with knowing eye. "Just like your grandfather wouldn't have known at your age." Later that afternoon, Marcus sat in Port Haven's only cafe, laptop open to an old maritime database. Ellie slid into the booth opposite him, setting down 2 mugs of coffee. "Find anything interesting?" she asked, peering at his screen. "Trying to track the Siren's Call before it came here," Marcus replied. "There's almost nothing official, no registration, no shipping records." "Ghost ship." Ellie wiggled her fingers dramatically. Something like that. But there are stories, sailors' accounts, harbor logs from ports across the Atlantic. A ship matching its description, commanded by someone named Bartholomew Drake. Sounds properly piratical. Ellie smirked. What was his thing? Plunder, kidnapping, buried treasure. Supposedly he found things, artifacts, relics, things that shouldn't exist or had been lost to history. Marcus pulled up a scanned journal entry. This account from 1823 claims Drake returned from an expedition with an object that sang with voices no human should hear. Creepy. Ellie shivered. But you don't actually believe that, right? Marcus didn't answer immediately. The latest storm had indeed shifted the ship, creating a gap between the vessel and the abandoned pier. A gap narrow enough for someone agile to jump across. I'm going in tomorrow, he said quietly. Before dawn, when the harbor's empty. Are you insane? Ellie hissed. Those no trespassing signs aren't suggestions, Marcus. That ship is condemned. I've been researching this for years, he countered, reading about it, drawing it, dreaming about it. Don't you think it's time I actually saw it for myself? Ellie's expression softened. At least let me come with you. No way. If I get caught, I don't want you in trouble too. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat at his window, staring at the ship's silhouette against the moonlit harbor. His grandfather's journal lay open beside him, turned to an entry from night. The Blackwood blood calls to the sea, and to secrets best left undisturbed, his great-grandfather had written. Some vessels are more than wood and sail, they carry fates that span generations. As first light crept across the horizon, Marcus packed his backpack, flashlight, camera, notebook, water bottle, and a small first aid kit. He slipped out his window and down the oak tree beside the house, heart hammering against his ribs. Today, after years of longing and preparation, he would finally step aboard the Siren's call. Dawn painted the harbor in watercolor grays as Marcus crept along the abandoned pier. Mist clung to the water's surface, providing welcome cover from early rising fishermen. The weathered planks creaked beneath his feet, each sound amplified in the morning stillness. The siren's call loomed before him, more imposing up close than he'd imagined. Decades of salt air had stripped away most of its paint, leaving the wood beneath silver gray and cracked like ancient skin. Barnacles crusted the visible hull, while tattered remnants of sails hung limply from the yards above. Marcus paused at the edge of the pier, heart hammering against his ribs. The storm had indeed shifted the vessel, creating a narrow gap, 3 feet of dark water separating him from the ship's main deck. Not impossible, but a fall would mean frigid water and possibly worse if he struck his head. Just do it, he whispered to himself, backing up several paces. Then, with a deep breath, he sprinted forward and leaped across the gap. His feet hit the deck with a hollow thud. For one terrifying moment, the wood seemed to give beneath him, but then held. Marcus froze, listening for any sign his trespass had been noticed. Only the gentle lapping of waves against the hull broke the silence. Pulling his flashlight from his backpack, Marcus swept the beam across the main deck. The wood was weathered, but surprisingly intact. What struck him immediately was the absence of debris. No bird droppings, no wind-blown trash, as if something kept the ship cleaner than its abandoned status should allow. A shiver ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. The main hatch, leading below decks, stood partially open, a gaping mouth into darkness. Marcus checked his watch. 5:47. He had perhaps an hour before the harbor came properly alive with the day's activities. The steps leading down were treacherous, several missing entirely. The air below decks hit him like a physical presence, cold, damp, and carrying a scent he couldn't place. Not just the expected mildew and rot, but something else, something metallic and ancient. His flashlight beam cut through darkness that seemed unnaturally thick. The beam didn't penetrate as far as it should, as if the blackness possessed substance. "Hello," Marcus called softly, then immediately regretted it. His voice echoed strangely, seeming to continue long after it should have faded. The main hold was largely empty, save for broken barrels and rotted rope. Marcus documented everything with his camera, the flash momentarily banishing the shadows. As he advanced deeper into the ship, he noticed his compass keychain spinning erratically, the needle whirling without settling on north. Electronic interference, he muttered, though nothing electrical should be functioning on this abandoned vessel. A narrow companionway led toward the stern, where the captain's quarters would be located. As Marcus moved along it, the temperature dropped noticeably. His breath fogged in front of him. Despite the summer warmth outside, something skittered in the darkness ahead, too large to be a rat. Marcus froze, flashlight beam darting to track the sound. Nothing visible, yet he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The door to the captain's quarters hung askew on a single hinge. Marcus squeezed through the opening into a surprisingly intact room. Unlike the rest of the ship, this space seemed preserved, the large desk bolted to the floor, a sea chest against one wall, even tattered curtains still hanging at the small window. Most striking was the large bed, built into the wall, its posts carved with intricate designs, creatures that were neither fully fish nor human writhing up the darkened wood. On the desk lay a large leather-bound book, its cover cracked and discolored with age. Marcus approached cautiously, camera documenting everything. The book lay open, its pages filled with handwriting in faded brown ink. "Captain's logbook," Marcus whispered reverently. He shone his light directly on the exposed pages, revealing entries dated. The handwriting was elegant but cramped, the letters pressed close together as if the writer had too much to say and too little space. "March 15, 1824, Marcus read aloud. "The artifact responds to blood, my blood specifically. Fletcher believes it recognizes lineage, though how a thing of metal and stone can know such matters is beyond mortal understanding." Marcus turned the page carefully. March 20, 3 men lost their minds today. They claimed to hear singing from the lower hold where we keep the artifact. When I investigated, I heard nothing but the normal creaks of the ship. Yet when I placed my hand upon the object, I too heard the voices. They speak of depths where no light has ever reached, and creatures older than mankind. A sudden creak from above startled Marcus. His flashlight beam wavered, and for an instant he thought he saw movement in the corner of the cabin, a darker shape within the shadows, watching. When he steadied the light, nothing was there. Marcus's fingers trembled as he continued to turn the brittle pages of the logbook. The further he read, the more disturbed Captain Drake's entries became. April 3, 1824. We sail for home waters, though I question if that is wise. The artifact's influence grows stronger. Last night I dreamed of ancient cities beneath the waves, where beings with too many limbs performed rituals around stone altars. I awoke to find myself standing at the ship's rail, prepared to step into the abyss. The men whisper that we are cursed. A hollow thud resonated through the ship, followed by the distinct sound of wood shifting against wood. Marcus froze, holding his breath. The entire vessel seemed to creak and settle, like a sleeping giant adjusting its position. He returned his attention to the captain's desk, noting a peculiar pattern in the wood grain of its surface. Unlike the natural whorls expected in timber, these lines formed what appeared to be a deliberate design, concentric circles with strange symbols between them. Tracing the pattern with his fingertip, Marcus felt a slight depression at the center. He pressed firmly, and with a soft click, a hidden drawer slid open beneath the desktop. Inside lay a small object wrapped in faded velvet. With cautious movements, Marcus unwrapped the cloth, revealing a medallion approximately 3 inches in diameter. Its surface was tarnished almost black, but as his fingers made contact, the metal warmed instantly. The medallion was intricately carved with the same writhing figures he'd seen on the bedders, half-human, half-aquatic creatures circling a central gemstone that glowed with a faint, pulsing blue-green light. "Impossible," Marcus whispered. The glow should have faded centuries ago, yet it brightened at his touch, as if responding to his presence. Without warning, the medallion grew hot in his palm. Marcus gasped as a flash of images invaded his mind. A tall man in period naval attire standing at the ship's helm during a violent storm, eyes fixed on a point beyond the horizon where something massive moved beneath the waves. The vision vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving Marcus disoriented. He nearly dropped the medallion but managed to secure it in his palm. The ship groaned loudly, timbers shifting with sounds too substantial for a vessel long abandoned. The floor beneath Marcus tilted slightly, causing the chair beside the desk to slide several inches across the wooden planks. Fear gripped him now. Whatever was happening, he needed to leave immediately. He quickly wrapped the medallion back in its velvet covering and stuffed it into his jacket pocket. As Marcus turned to exit the captain's quarters, the door, which had hung open on its broken hinge, slowly swung closed. With a definitive click, heart pounding, he pushed against the wooden panel, which now felt unnaturally solid. It refused to budge for several terrifying seconds before finally giving way with a reluctant creak. The companionway outside was noticeably darker than before, despite the advancing dawn that should have filtered through the ship's many cracks and breaks. Marcus's flashlight beam seemed weaker, barely penetrating the gloom ahead. He moved quickly now, no longer concerned with documenting his exploration. The medallion in his pocket felt heavy, its warmth penetrating the fabric against his chest. As he navigated the narrow passage, a distinct sound echoed from somewhere deep in the ship's hold, a soft, rhythmic noise like the lapping of waves, though they were well above the waterline. Accompanying this came what Marcus could only describe as whispering in a language he'd never heard, the syllables sliding together in patterns that hurt his ears. The main deck, when he finally emerged, was bathed in early morning light, the mist burning away with the rising sun. The familiar sight of Port Haven beyond the ship's rail provided momentary relief, until Marcus noticed the Barnacles, where the railing had been crusted with decades of marine growth. Patches now appeared clean, the wood beneath looking freshly oiled rather than weathered. Several of the deck planks that had been grey with age now showed hints of their original honey color. The ship was changing. With a final glance at the captain's quarters below, Marcus took a running leap back to the pier. His feet hit the weathered wood with bone-jarring impact, sending pain shooting up his shins. He didn't stop, running full tilt along the abandoned structure until he reached solid ground. Only then did he pause to catch his breath, turning to look at the siren's call silhouetted against the rising sun. From this distance, it appeared unchanged, the same derelict vessel that had occupied the harbor for decades. But Marcus knew differently now. He patted his pocket, feeling the outline of the medallion through the fabric. That night, locked in his bedroom, Marcus was plagued by dreams of stormy seas and a deep voice calling his name. Captain Bartholomew Drake's face, impossibly detailed for someone he'd never seen, loomed in his subconscious, eyes reflecting the same eerie blue-green glow as the medallion hidden beneath Marcus's mattress. The Port Haven Library's research section was deserted when Marcus slipped into a back corner table, spreading out several heavy tomes on maritime history and symbolism. He'd avoided looking at the medallion since hiding it under his mattress 2 nights ago, but the symbols remained burned in his memory, demanding answers. "Thought I'd find you here," Ellie whispered, sliding into the chair opposite him. "You look terrible. Aren't you sleep?" "Not really," Marcus admitted, keeping his voice low. The dark circles under his eyes confirmed his words. "You went to the ship, didn't you?" Ellie studied his face, already knowing the answer. Before Marcus could respond, an unfamiliar voice interrupted. "Excuse me, but did I hear you mention the siren's call?" The speaker was a tall man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His tweed jacket and scholarly demeanor seemed out of place in the small coastal town. "Professor Hargrove," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Visiting scholar from Miskatonic University, Department of Marine Archaeology." Marcus hesitated before shaking the offered hand. "Marcus Blackwood. This is Ellie Martinez." "Blackwood?" Hargrove's eyebrows rose with apparent recognition. Any relation to the Blackwood shipping family from the 1800s? Distantly, Marcus replied cautiously. My grandfather might know more about that branch of the family. Fascinating. Hargrove smiled. I'm researching New England trading vessels, particularly those with unusual histories. The Siren's Call is quite the mystery in maritime circles. Why's that? Ellie asked, while Marcus remained silent. Its provenance is remarkably difficult to trace, Hargrove explained, his enthusiasm evident. Records suggest it was captained by Bartholomew Drake, who had quite the reputation for finding rare artifacts on his voyages. Some colleagues dismiss the stories as sailors' superstition, but historical accounts are surprisingly consistent. What kind of artifacts? Marcus found himself asking despite his reservations. Objects of alleged mystical significance. Drake claimed to have discovered relics from civilizations that predated known history. Hargrove glanced at the books on their table. I see you're researching similar topics. Mind if I join you? Before Marcus could formulate a polite refusal, Mitterton appeared with a large volume bound in faded green leather. Here's that book you requested, Marcus, she said, eyeing Professor Hargrove with obvious suspicion. Maritime legends and occult connections. It's quite rare not to leave the library undiscovered. Yes, ma'am, Marcus nodded, accepting the heavy tome. Professor, Miss Patterson acknowledged Hargrove coolly. I understand you've been asking about our ship. Just professional curiosity, he smiled. Such vessels often have fascinating histories. Indeed, she replied dryly, some histories are best left alone. After the librarian departed, Hargrove excused himself, leaving his card with an invitation to contact him if they discovered anything interesting about the Siren's Call. He gives me the creeps, Ellie whispered once the professor was out of earshot. Agreed, Marcus murmured, opening the book Miss Patterson had brought. Its pages were filled with illustrations of unusual artifacts and accounts of their supposed powers. Hours later, Marcus found what he was looking for, an illustration remarkably similar to the medallion labeled The Heart of the Siren, believed lost at sea circa 8. The description chilled him. Said to whisper knowledge of elder beings to those of particular bloodlines, accounts suggest it served as a key or binding agent in rituals whose purposes have been mercifully lost to time. That evening Marcus sat on his bed staring at the medallion, which he'd finally removed from its hiding place. The strange blue-green light pulsed more strongly now, casting eerie shadows across his walls. A soft knock at his door startled him. Marcus? His father called. Quickly rewrapping the medallion, Marcus shoved it under his pillow. Come in. James Blackwood entered, concern evident on his weathered face. Everything all right? You've been quiet the past few days. Just busy with school stuff, Marcus replied, avoiding his father's eye. Your grandfather mentioned you've been asking about family history, James said, sitting on the edge of the bed, uncomfortably close to where the medallion was hidden. About that ship? It's interesting, Marcus shrugged, trying to appear casual. Port Haven history. Listen, James's voice dropped. I know that old wreck has some kind of pull on the men in this family. Your grandfather was the same way at your age. Just be careful with the questions you're asking. Before Marcus could respond, a small puddle of seawater began forming on his wooden floor. Impossible, given they were on the second story of a house on high ground. Both stared in disbelief as the puddle expanded slightly before beginning to evaporate, leaving behind a crusty residue of salt. What the hell? James whispered. Later that night, Marcus showed the medallion to Ellie via video chat, carefully keeping it wrapped, except for a small exposed section. I found it on the ship, he admitted. You need to put it back, she insisted, eyes wide. I can't. Something's happening, Ellie. The ship was changing while I was on it. And look, he held up his hand where a small cut had appeared on his palm, though he had no memory of injuring himself. It's not healing, and sometimes it feels like there's something moving under the skin. Before Ellie could respond, the medallion pulsed brightly. Through the phone's speaker came her voice, but the words were wrong, archaic phrases in an accent centuries old. The captain awaits the return of what was his. she said, her eyes momentarily reflecting the medallion's glow. Blood calls to blood across the void. Then she blinked, the strange affect vanishing. What just happened? Marcus? But Marcus was already ending the call, staring at the medallion with newfound terror. The attic stairs creaked as Marcus followed his grandfather upward, flashlight beam bouncing off dust motes that danced in the air. After witnessing Ellie's strange episode, the previous night, he had called Eddie first thing in the morning, desperate for answers. Haven't been up here in years, Eddie wheezed, reaching the top landing. Your grandmother made me promise to keep this stuff, though Lord knows why. The attic was a museum of Blackwood history, furniture draped in sheets, trunks bursting with old clothing, photographs in frames that had gone out of style decades ago. Eddie moved with surprising purpose toward the far corner, where a large sea chest sat beneath the eaves. Been in the family for generations, Eddie explained, lowering himself with a grunt to one knee. He produced an antique key from his pocket. Your father doesn't know about this. Better it stays that way. The lock turned with a reluctant click. Inside the chest lay neatly folded naval uniforms, navigation instruments, and carefully preserved letters tied with faded ribbon. Your great-great-grandfather, Thomas Blackwood, Eddie said, gently removing a daguerreotype of a stern-faced man in a naval uniform. He served aboard the Siren's Call under Captain Drake. Marcus stared at the image, recognizing the same determined eyes that ran through the Blackwood line. You never told me we had a direct connection to the ship. Some history is better left buried, Eddie sighed, setting aside the photograph to withdraw a bundle of letters. Until it decides to unbury itself. He handed Marcus the letters, yellowed with age, but remarkably preserved. Thomas wrote these to his wife during his final voyage. They arrived 6 months after the Siren's Call was declared lost at sea. Marcus carefully opened the first letter, struggling to decipher the elegant but faded handwriting. My dearest Eleanor, he read aloud. The captain grows more disturbed with each passing day. The artifact we recovered from that accursed island has changed him. He speaks of voices calling from the deep, and has ordered us to sail far from our planned route, toward waters no sane sailor would enter. Keep reading, Eddie urged quietly. Marcus turned to the next page. I have made a difficult decision. Several of us plan to secure the artifact and make for the nearest port. What Drake intends cannot be allowed. The man I once respected has been consumed by something I dare not name. If you receive this letter, know that I acted to protect not just our family, but all families from what might emerge from the depths. If Drake succeeds, so our ancestor was part of a mutiny, Marcus whispered, looking up from the letter. Not mutiny, salvation, Eddie corrected. The final letter explains more. Marcus read the last letter with growing unease. Thomas described stealing 1/3 of the heart and hiding it where no man could use it to complete the ritual. The letter ended with a warning that the remaining pieces still posed danger if united. But the ship came back, Marcus said, confused. It's been sitting in our harbor for decades. Towed in for restoration in 1962. Nobody knows where it was found or how it survived a century at sea. Eddie's gaze was distant. Within a month of its arrival, Port Haven experienced the worst storm in its history. 12 fishing boats lost. My father, your great-grandfather, was the only survivor from his vessel. Eddie reached deeper into the chest, retrieving a leather-bound journal. He wrote everything down afterward. How he alone heard a voice calling from the Siren's Call as they passed it in the harbor. How he alone survived when their boat capsized. How he would wake up soaking wet with salt water, though he lived 3 miles in. Thunder rumbled outside, though the morning had been clear when Marcus arrived. Both glanced toward the small attic window where dark clouds now gathered over the harbor. Weather service didn't predict this, Eddie murmured, his weathered face tight with concern. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. Weird tide today. Harbor water receding. Boats stranded on mud. Harbor master confused. Show me the medallion, Eddie said suddenly. Marcus hesitated, then withdrew the velvet-wrapped object from his pocket. As he unwrapped it, the blue-green light pulsed stronger than before, illuminating the attic with its unnatural glow. Eddie gasped, his hand trembling as he reached toward it without quite touching the surface. The markings, just as Thomas described, 1/3 of the heart of the siren. "What does it do?" Marcus asked. "It's a key, boy, and a prison." Eddie's eyes reflected the medallion's light. Drake found something out there in the deep ocean. Something ancient. Something that should have remained forgotten. "This," he gestured to the medallion, "helps control it or contain it. The stories aren't clear, and I've removed it from the ship," Marcus realized, horror dawning. "The storm that night," Eddie nodded grimly. "The ship changing. It's starting again." The wind outside intensified, rattling the attic window. In the distance, waves crashed against the harbor wall with unusual force. "Your father needs to know," Eddie said, struggling to his feet. "The Blackwood family has been bound to that cursed ship for generations. It's time he accepted his part in this." As they descended from the attic, the medallion still clutched in Marcus's hand. Neither noticed the water seeping under the attic door, seawater, impossibly present 3 blocks from the shore, and 2 stories above the ground. Nor did they see the faint outline of a tall figure in period naval attire standing in the corner, watching with eyes that glowed the same blue-green as the medallion, before dissolving into mist. The argument between Marcus's father and grandfather had lasted for hours, their voices rising and falling like the increasingly erratic tides in the harbor. James Blackwood had refused to believe their family tales were anything more than superstition, even when confronted with the medallion's unnatural glow and the inexplicable seawater that had begun appearing throughout their home. "I need to go back to the ship," Marcus told Ellie as they stood on the harbor walk. The following afternoon, watching dark clouds gather despite forecasts for clear skies. "There has to be more information there. After everything your grandfather told you." Ellie shook her head in disbelief. "Marcus, this is insane. That thing," she pointed to his pocket where the medallion was hidden, "made me speak words I don't remember saying, in a language I don't know, which is exactly why we need answers," Marcus insisted. "Something's happening to Port Haven. Look," he gestured toward the harbor, where fishing boats rocked violently, despite minimal wind. The water itself seemed wrong, unusually dark and thick, with periodic ripples that moved against the current. "Fine," Ellie sighed, "but we go together, and we tell someone where we're going this time." "Deal," Marcus agreed, surprised by her capitulation. "Not your dad, though," she added. "He'll just try to stop us." "Miss Patterson," Marcus suggested. "She knows more than she lets on, and she has keys to the town archives if we need them afterward." The librarian listened to their plan with surprising calm, her aged fingers tracing the medallion's engravings through the velvet wrapping, without actually touching the metal. "I always knew it would be a Blackwood," she murmured. "The patterns repeat, generation after generation." She fixed Marcus with a penetrating stare. "Be back before sunset. If you're not, I'm calling the harbor patrol." The journey to the Siren's Call was more difficult this time. The abandoned pier had partially collapsed overnight, requiring a more precarious approach from the adjacent marina. As they drew closer, both teenagers stopped in shock. The ship had changed dramatically. Areas that had been decayed just days before now appeared restored, patches of fresh paint gleaming on the hull, new rope in the rigging, even the figurehead at the bow, looking less weathered and more defined. "That's not possible," Ellie whispered, raising her camera to document the impossible renovation. "Nothing about this is possible," Marcus replied grimly as they made the dangerous jump onto the deck. Inside, the transformation was even more pronounced. Lanterns hung in the passageways, though none were lit. The wood of the floors and walls appeared oiled and cared for. Most disturbing were the footprints visible in the thin layer of dust, footprints that appeared and disappeared at random intervals, as if their owners had walked through solid objects. "The captain's quarters," Marcus said, leading the way. "That's where I found the medallion." The room had transformed completely. The broken furniture was now intact, the bed made with faded but clean linens. The desk gleamed with polish, and the captain's logbook lay open, its pages no longer brittle but supple as if recently written upon. "Marcus," Ellie called softly from a corner of the room. "Look at this." She had discovered a hidden panel in the wall, revealed by the shifting of the ship during recent storms. Behind it was a small compartment containing a flat wooden case, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Inside the case lay an ancient star chart drawn on what appeared to be animal skin. Constellations were marked with the same strange symbols found on the medallion, connecting to form patterns around a central point in the night sky. "It's a map," Marcus realized, carefully removing it, but not for ocean navigation. As his fingers touched the chart, the medallion in his pocket pulsed warmly. The star patterns on the chart briefly glowed with the same blue-green light before fading. "Put that down," a voice commanded from the doorway. They spun to find Professor Hargrove standing there, his scholarly demeanor replaced by something harder and more determined. In his hand was an object that made Marcus's blood run cold. A second medallion, nearly identical to the one he carried, but with different engravings along its edge. "How did you get on board?" Marcus demanded, instinctively stepping in front of Ellie. "I have certain privileges when it comes to this vessel," Hargrove replied, his eyes fixed on the star chart. "As do you, apparently, young Mr. Blackwood. Blood recognizes blood, even across centuries." "You know about the medallions," Marcus said. "Not a question. The heart of the siren." Hargrove nodded. "3 pieces, separated long ago to prevent their power from being misused. I've spent decades tracking them down." His gaze shifted to Marcus's pocket. "And now, thanks to you, I'm one step closer to having all 3. "What is it?" Ellie asked. "What does it do?" "It's a key," Hargrove explained, echoing Eddie's words. "But also so much more. It's a beacon, a binding agent, and a translator." He took a step forward. "The entities that Captain Drake discovered require a specific alignment to fully manifest an alignment of celestial bodies, artifacts, and bloodlines." "You're insane," Marcus said, though the medallion pulsing against his chest suggested otherwise. "Am I?" Hargrove smiled thinly. "Ask the fisherman who reported singing from the deep waters beyond the harbor yesterday. Ask the harbor master about the unprecedented marine life behavior. Something is awakening, Marcus, and we are merely players in a drama that began centuries ago." A low groaning sound reverberated through the ship, wood creaking and shifting around them. Through the small window, Marcus could see figures moving on the deck, indistinct, translucent shapes, going about duties no living sailor had performed in generations. "The crew," Hargrove said softly. "They return as the veil thins. Spectral now, but growing more substantial with each passing day." "We need to leave," Marcus urged Ellie, clutching the star chart. "The chart stays," Hargrove insisted. "And we go," Marcus countered, noting the professor's position blocking the only exit. "For now," Hargrove conceded after a tense moment. "But we'll continue this conversation soon, very soon." Marcus awoke to the sound of his father pounding on his bedroom door. He'd barely slept after their narrow escape from the siren's call, and Professor Hargrove the previous day. "Harbor patrols on the phone," James called through the door. "They want to know why you and Ellie were seen near that damn ship yesterday." Marcus groaned, shoving the medallion and star chart deeper under his mattress. Before opening the door, his father stood there, telephone in hand, expression thunderous. "Ian, explain," Marcus began. "Save it," James thrust the phone at him. "Talk to Officer Brennan. Then we're having a conversation about boundaries and trespassing." The call was brief and uncomfortable. Yes, they had been near the ship. No, they hadn't gone aboard, a lie that tasted bitter on Marcus's tongue. Yes, they understood the danger. No, it wouldn't happen again. When he hung up, his father was waiting with arms crossed. "Your grandfather has been filling your head with nonsense for years. I've tolerated it, because it seemed harmless. But this obsession has gone too far." "Dad, there's more happening than you understand," Marcus protested. "You're grounded. Indefinitely. James's tone left no room for argument. And I'm calling Principal Reynolds to explain why you'll be coming straight home after school for the foreseeable future. Marcus slumped onto his bed after his father left, the unfairness burning in his chest. His phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. Museum today? Important. Despite his grounding, Marcus slipped out when his father left for work. The Port Haven Maritime Museum was housed in the old customs building overlooking the harbor. Inside, Ellie was waiting by a display of nautical instruments. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a glass case he'd walked past dozens of times before. Inside was a ship's bell, green with verdigris, except for a polished section revealing the name Siren's Call and the date 1822. The placard noted it had been recovered from the harbor in 1975 during dredging operations. "I remembered seeing it here," Ellie explained. "And after yesterday, I looked up old newspapers about its discovery." She showed him a printout from the museum archives. The article described unusual circumstances surrounding the bell's recovery, how the dredging crew reported hearing it ring before finding it buried in silt, how several workers experienced vivid hallucinations after touching it, and how the family who donated it to the museum moved away shortly after citing persistent dreams of drowning. "There's more," Ellie continued, leading him to a research terminal. "I found Professor Hargrove's academic profile. He specializes in arcane maritime artifacts and has published papers on something called transcosmic entities that supposedly existed before human civilization." "Transcosmic entities?" Marcus frowned. "Things from beyond our reality that supposedly visited Earth in ancient times," Ellie explained. "Most academics think it's pseudoscience, but Hargrove has spent his career trying to prove they were real." A museum docent approached, an elderly man with a Port Haven Historical Society badge. "Interested in our ship's bell, are you? Not many young folks pay attention to that exhibit." "We're doing research on the Siren's Call," Marcus explained. "Do you know anything about it that's not in the displays?" The old man glanced around before lowering his voice. "Official history says it was just another trading vessel, but my grandfather was on the salvage crew that brought it to Port Haven in '62. He said they found it drifting unmanned nearly 200 miles offshore, perfectly preserved, despite being lost since the 80s. No notion for how it survived or where it had been all those years." "And the bell?" Ellie prompted. "Found years later, yet in better condition than it should have been after a century and a half underwater." The docent shook his head. "Strangest thing, when they brought it up, several people reported hearing it ring during the night shift, though nobody was near it." As the docent moved away to greet other visitors, Marcus's phone rang. It was his father. "Principal Reynolds just called me," James said, his voice tight with anger. "Seems you never arrived at school today." "Dad, I can explain. Home. Now." The call ended abruptly. Outside the museum, dark clouds gathered over the harbor, though the weather service had again predicted clear skies. The water looked wrong, too dark, too thick, with unnatural ripples spreading outward from where the Siren's Call was moored. "We need to research the star chart," Marcus told Ellie. "There's a celestial alignment coming. That's what Hargrove is waiting for." "How do you know that?" Ellie asked. Marcus hesitated. "I've been having dreams, detailed dreams about Captain Drake and his discoveries. Last night I dreamed about a ritual performed during a specific astronomical alignment when certain stars converged above a point in the Atlantic." "That's not possible," Ellie whispered. "Neither is anything else that's happening," Marcus replied. "The medallion is changing me, Ellie. I can feel it. Sometimes I have thoughts that don't feel like my own." Back home, Marcus endured his father's lecture in silence, unable to explain the truth without sounding insane. Later, confined to his room, he studied the star chart under his desk lamp. The central point marked on the chart corresponded to a specific arrangement of stars that, according to his research on his laptop, would occur in 3 days' time. The spring equinox, accompanied by a rare lunar eclipse that happened only once every 50. Outside his window he could see the Siren's Call in the distance. Even from here, he could tell it had changed further, the masts now fully intact, the hull gleaming darkly in the fading light. More disturbingly, he could see movement on deck, the ghostly crew going about their duties with increasing solidity as the destined night approached. The harbour inn where Professor Hargrove was staying overlooked the water, providing a clear view of the siren's call, perfect for a man obsessed with the vessel. Marcus thought as he and Ellie crouched beneath the window of room 12, waiting for the professor to leave for his evening meal. 2 days had passed since their confrontation aboard the ship. 2 days of increasingly strange occurrences throughout Port Haven, unexplained power outages, compass needles spinning wildly, 3 fishing boats reporting navigation systems failing simultaneously. Most disturbing were the accounts from fishermen who swore they'd heard singing from the deep waters beyond the harbour, beautiful, terrible voices that made them long to dive overboard. "There he goes," Ellie whispered as Hargrove emerged from his room, briefcase in hand, and headed toward the inn's restaurant. "We've got maybe 30 minutes. The window lock yielded easily to Marcus's pocket knife. The old inn hadn't updated its security in decades. Inside, the professor's room was meticulously organized, research materials arranged in precise stacks on every surface. "Look for Effin about Drake's journal," Marcus instructed, heading for the briefcase Hargrove had left on the desk. "The real one, not the logbook I found on the ship." While Ellie searched through papers spread across the bed, Marcus worked on the briefcase's combination lock. The medallion in his pocket grew warm, almost guiding his fingers as he turned the dials. With a satisfying click, the case opened. Inside lay a leather-bound book significantly smaller than the captain's logbook, its cover unmarked, except for the initials BD, embossed in faded gold. Beside it sat a wooden box containing the second medallion piece they'd seen Hargrove carrying on the ship. "Found something," Ellie called softly, holding up a manila folder. "Hargrove's research on the Blackwood family. He's been tracking your lineage for years, Marcus. There are birth certificates, obituaries, newspaper clippings about your ancestors going back 6 generations. A chill ran down Marcus's spine. He knew who I was before we met. "It gets worse," Ellie continued, scanning the documents. "He has surveillance photos of your grandfather from last year, and you, entering and leaving school." Marcus opened Drake's personal journal with trembling hands. Unlike the formal logbook, this contained the captain's private thoughts, written in a more urgent, intimate style. He flipped to the final entries, dated just before the ship's disappearance, May 17, 1824. He read aloud. "The entity grows stronger as we approach the coordinates. I can feel its attention turning toward us, ancient and cold. The crew senses it too, though they have not heard the voices as I have. Last night, Williams and Cooper attempted to steal the heart. I was forced to execute them as an example. The others now watch me with fear, but I cannot afford dissent. What waits beneath the waves will transform our understanding of this world and our place in it." Marcus turned the page. May 19, 1824. "Blackwood has betrayed me. He and 7 others overwhelmed the loyal crew members and stole 1/3 of the heart. They took a longboat in the night, hoping to reach Portugal. I cannot pursue them without delaying the ritual. The stars align in 3 days' time, and the entity stirs in anticipation. I have communed with it again tonight. It promises knowledge, maddens human comprehension, power to command the very elements. All it requires is a vessel, a human host, with the right bloodline to serve as its anchor in our world." "A host?" Ellie whispered, looking up from Hargrove's papers. "Drake was trying to summon something that would possess him." "Not exactly," Marcus replied, continuing to read. "He wasn't trying to contain something, he was trying to release it. Listen to this. Mate, the fools who remained aboard believe I seek to control the entity, to bind it to my will. They do not understand that I seek liberation, its liberation. For millennia it has been imprisoned beneath the ocean floor by ancient magics, yearning for freedom. I shall be remembered as the man who returned a god to this world." The final entry chilled Marcus to the bone. May 22, 1824. The alignment comes tonight. Blackwood's theft has complicated matters. The ritual requires the complete heart to fully break the bindings. But even incomplete, it should weaken the prison enough for the entity to partially emerge. I have prepared the ship as an interim vessel to house its essence until I can recover the missing piece. My blood will serve as the conduit, my life force the key. If I do not survive the initial merging, perhaps another of my bloodline will one day complete what I have begun. The journal ended there. The final ritual, whatever happened, had not been recorded. Drake wasn't trying to contain some evil, Marcus realized, closing the journal with shaking hands. He was trying to release it. The heart of the siren isn't a weapon against this entity, it's the key to its prison. And by removing the piece from the ship, Ellie began. I've started the process Drake couldn't finish, Marcus finished grimly. The ship isn't haunted, it's becoming a vessel for whatever's awakening out there. The door handle rattled suddenly. They froze as a key slid into the lock. Quick, Marcus hissed, shoving Drake's journal into his jacket and grabbing Hargrove's medallion piece. They scrambled out the window just as the door opened, dropping into the bushes below with painful thuds. Without looking back, they sprinted down the hill toward town. Why would he come back so soon? Ellie gasped as they ran. He knows, Marcus panted. Somehow he knows we were there. They didn't stop running until they reached the harbor walkway, both breathing hard. In the distance, the siren's call loomed against the evening sky, more intact than ever. What had been ghostly crew members were now clearly visible, solid figures moving about the deck with purpose. We need to tell someone, Ellie insisted. Your father, the police, anyone. And say what? That a centuries-old sea captain is trying to release an ancient entity using magical medallions. Marcus shook his head. We'd end up in psychiatric evaluation. A familiar truck pulled into the harbor parking lot. His father's vehicle, James Blackwood, stepped out, his expression grim as he spotted them. Your grandfather collapsed, he said without preamble. They've taken him to the hospital. He's been asking for you. At the hospital, Eddie Blackwood looked diminished against the white sheets, his normally ruddy complexion pale and drawn. His eyes brightened slightly when Marcus entered the room. You found something, the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, pulling out Drake's journal and explaining what they'd discovered in Hargrove's room. His father listened from the doorway, expression shifting from skepticism to concern as the story unfolded. There's more, Eddie said when Marcus finished. He weakly motioned toward the small table beside his bed where a Bible lay. The family Bible. Brought it with me when I felt the attack coming. There's something you need to see. Marcus opened the ancient book to where a ribbon marked a page in Genesis. Between the pages lay a folded piece of parchment, covered in the same handwriting as Thomas Blackwood's letters. Your father never believed the old stories, Eddie explained, looking toward James. But our family wasn't just trying to stop Drake. We were appointed guardians. Thomas Blackwood didn't betray his captain out of moral outrage. He was carrying out a duty passed down through his own bloodline to prevent the entity's release at any cost. James stepped fully into the room now, his lifelong skepticism visibly crumbling as he looked at the assembled evidence. The ship arriving in Port Haven wasn't coincidence, Eddie continued. It came here because of us, because the Blackwood blood calls to it, just as it calls to us. Outside the hospital window, dark clouds gathered over the harbor, and a wind began to rise, carrying with it the faint sound of unearthly singing from the deep. The family Bible lay open on Eddie's hospital tray table, its pages yellowed with age. Marcus carefully unfolded the hidden parchment his grandfather had indicated, revealing a letter written in faded ink. It's in code, Marcus observed, studying the seemingly random arrangement of letters and numbers. Not exactly, Eddie replied weakly. It's English, but written using a cipher known only to the Blackwood family. Your father knows it. James stepped forward reluctantly, studying the document with a furrowed brow. Dad taught me when I was a boy. I always thought it was just a game. He took a deep breath. It's a letter from Thomas to his son, explaining the truth about what happened aboard the Siren's Call. As James translated, a very different story emerged from the one Marcus had pieced together. Thomas Blackwood hadn't led a mutiny against a captain gone mad. Instead, he had been working with Drake, helping him research the ancient entity. But when they discovered its true nature, something so malevolent it had been imprisoned by multiple ancient civilizations, Drake had a change of heart. He tried to abort the ritual. James read, his voice growing more troubled with each line. But by then something had already attached itself to him. The entity had begun to influence him, promising him power and knowledge if he would complete the ritual. Thomas and several loyal crew members had formulated a desperate plan. They couldn't kill Drake. The partial bonding meant the entity would simply take full control of his body upon death. Instead, they split the heart of the siren into 3 pieces, hiding one and keeping the others separate to prevent the ritual's completion. The entity was too strong to be fully re-imprisoned without the complete heart. James continued reading. So Drake, in a moment of clarity, ordered the loyal crew to abandon ship, while he performed a modified ritual to bind the entity to the vessel itself instead of releasing it. He used his own blood to create a temporary seal, knowing it would eventually weaken. The letter ended with a warning that the entity would never stop seeking freedom, and that future Blackwoods must remain vigilant, as their blood connection to Drake made them potential vessels should the entity escape its prison. That's why the ship appeared in Port Haven, Eddie explained. It was drawn to the Blackwood bloodline, and that's why I've always warned you away from it. But I've broken the seal by removing one piece of the heart, Marcus said, the weight of his actions crushing down on him. And Hargrove has the second piece, Ellie added. Where's the third? James asked. Eddie shook his head. Thomas's letter doesn't say. He kept that secret even from his descendants, to ensure the pieces could never be reunited. A nurse entered, informing them that visiting hours were ending. As Marcus prepared to leave, his grandfather grasped his wrist with surprising strength. The medallion, Eddie whispered. Let me see it. Marcus carefully withdrew both pieces, the one he'd found on the ship and the one taken from Hargrove's room. In the sterile hospital lighting, they pulsed with an eerie blue-green glow that seemed to strengthen when brought near each other. Eddie studied them, his weathered fingers hovering just above their surfaces. They want to be reunited, he observed, like magnets drawn to each other. What happens if all 3 pieces come together? Marcus asked. The entity gains enough strength to fully manifest. Eddie replied grimly. Drake's blood seal was meant to be temporary, a century at most. It's held for 2 centuries only because the heart was separated. With 2 pieces in proximity, the seal is already failing. Marcus's phone buzzed with a weather alert. Severe storm warning for Port Haven and surrounding coastal areas. Unusual tidal activity, coastal flooding possible. It's beginning, Eddie whispered. As they left the hospital, the storm had intensified. Wind whipped rain sideways, and lightning split the sky directly above the harbor, where the Siren's Call was now fully restored, its running lights glowing despite having no power source. I'm going home to get some things, James told Marcus, and Ellie, his former skepticism completely abandoned. Then we're heading to my fishing cabin inland, until this passes. We can't just leave, Marcus protested. Whatever's happening is partly my fault. And what exactly do you plan to do about it? His father demanded. Before Marcus could answer, a sleek black SUV pulled alongside them in the hospital parking lot. The window lowered to reveal Professor Hargrove. I believe you have something of mine, he said pleasantly, though his eyes were hard. And I have something you might want to see. He held up an object that made all 3 of them freeze, a third medallion piece, identical to the others, but with different engravings. The final piece of the heart, Hargrove confirmed, recovered at great expense from a private collector in Amsterdam last month. Imagine my surprise when I learned the first piece had been removed from the ship after all these years. You've accelerated my timeline considerably, Mr. Blackwood. How did you find it? Marcus demanded. Thomas Blackwood hid it. Thomas Blackwood sold it, Hargrove corrected. Desperate for funds after settling in Portugal, the collector's family held it for generations, unaware of its significance. He smiled thinly. The eclipse occurs tomorrow night. I suggest we continue this conversation about our shared ancestry in a more private setting. Shared ancestry? James echoed. Oh yes, Hargrove's smile widened. My great-great-grandfather was Captain Samuel Hargrove, Drake's first mate and most bitter rival. Our families have been entwined in this drama for 2 centuries. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the siren's call in the distance. For a moment, all of them could clearly see a tall figure standing at the helm, watching the hospital with glowing blue-green eyes. I won't help you release it, Marcus stated firmly, staring across the table at Professor Hargrove in the nearly empty hospital cafeteria. Rain lashed against the windows as the storm intensified outside. You misunderstand my intentions, Hargrove replied, placing a leather portfolio on the table. I don't wish to release the entity. I want to control it. He opened the portfolio, revealing meticulously organized research materials, photocopies of ancient texts, star charts, similar to the one Marcus had found, and detailed notes on ritual procedures. For 5 generations, my family has studied what Drake discovered, Hargrove explained. Where your ancestors chose to hide from this power, mine sought to understand and harness it. It can't be controlled, James interrupted. Thomas Blackwood's letter was clear about that. Thomas Blackwood was a superstitious sailor. Hargrove I am a scholar with access to research he could never have imagined. The ritual Drake attempted was flawed because he lacked critical information about the binding parameters. Hargrove pulled out a document titled Theoretical Applications of Transcosmic Energy, his own research paper filled with complex equations and ritual diagrams. The entity is essentially pure energy from a dimension that intersects with ours only under specific conditions, he continued. With the proper containment vessel and the complete heart of the siren, that energy can be directed, utilized. For what purpose? Ellie asked, speaking for the first time. Advancement of human knowledge, clean energy, perhaps even the key to interdimensional travel. Hargrove's eyes gleamed with zealous conviction. The possibilities are limitless. You're insane, Marcus said flatly. People are already being affected. Fishermen hearing voices, navigation systems failing. 3 boats went missing yesterday. Minor disruptions compared to what's coming if we do nothing. Hargrove countered. Drake's blood seal is failing regardless of our actions. The entity has been gradually awakening since the moment the first piece was removed from the ship. We have 2 choices. Attempt to control the process, or allow an uncontrolled manifestation that could devastate the entire eastern seaboard. Thunder shook the building as if emphasizing his point. What exactly are you proposing? James asked, his protective arm around Marcus's shoulders. A controlled ritual using all 3 pieces of the heart, Hargrove explained, with Marcus's blood connection to Drake and my understanding of the binding parameters. We can essentially upgrade the containment vessel from the ship to a more stable, purpose-built chamber I've constructed. He slid a blueprint across the table showing a complex arrangement of symbols and technology. Part scientific apparatus, part mystical array. And if something goes wrong, Marcus challenged, then we're no worse off than doing nothing. Hargrove replied with infuriating calm. The eclipse that will trigger the final awakening occurs tomorrow night at 11:27 p.m. With or without your cooperation, the entity will attempt to fully manifest. Marcus's phone chimed with a news alert. Unexplained maritime incidents escalate along New England coast. 3 fishing vessels missing. Coast Guard reports unprecedented instrument failures. It's spreading, Ellie whispered. Marcus felt the 2 medallion pieces in his pocket growing warmer, almost vibrating with proximity to the 3rd piece Hargrove, kept securely in an inner pocket. I need to talk to my grandfather again, Marcus insisted. Eddie was asleep when they returned to his room, his face lined with exhaustion. The doctor advised against waking him, explaining that his heart was weak and he needed rest. "We can't wait," Marcus told his father and Ellie once they were in the hallway. "I need to see Miss Patterson. She knows more about the town's history with the ship than she's telling." The rain had temporarily slackened when they arrived at the librarian's small cottage near the town archives. She answered the door in a flannel robe, unsurprised by their late visit. "I've been expecting you," she said, ushering them inside. The harbor bell has been ringing on its own for the past hour. Her cottage was filled with books and nautical artifacts, many related to the siren's call. On her dining table lay newspaper clippings documenting strange occurrences dating back to the ship's arrival in Port Haven. "Agnes Patterson isn't my birth name," she revealed, serving them tea with steady hands despite the circumstances. "I was born Agnes Blackwood, your father's third cousin. I changed my name when I took over as town archivist to avoid drawing attention to our family's connection to the ship." She disappeared into a back room, returning with a heavy wooden box. "I've been the unofficial keeper of our family's research on the entity and the ritual," she explained, opening the box to reveal yellowed papers, small artifacts, and a journal nearly identical to Drake's. "Every generation of Blackwoods has contributed to this knowledge, hoping to find a permanent solution." "And did they?" Marcus asked. "Not entirely," she admitted, "but they discovered something crucial that Hargrove likely doesn't know." She fixed Marcus with an intense gaze. "The entity cannot be controlled as he believes. Its consciousness is too alien, too vast. Anyone attempting to direct it would be immediately overwhelmed." "Then what can we do?" James asked. "There is a ritual to reinforce the binding," Patterson explained, "but it requires both the complete heart of the siren and—" "What?" Marcus prompted when she hesitated. "A blood sacrifice from Drake's lineage," she finished quietly. "Not death, but a permanent connection, a living anchor. The volunteer would be bound to the entity for life, required to maintain the seal through regular rituals. That's why no previous generation attempted it," Marcus realized. "They weren't willing to sacrifice one of their own." "Can we perform this ritual without Hargrove knowing our true intentions?" Ellie asked. "Possibly," Miss Patterson nodded. "His research appears impressive, but focuses entirely on control, not containment. If we can get all three pieces of the heart together at the proper time." A tremendous crash of thunder cut her off, rattling windows throughout the cottage. Outside, the storm had intensified again, the wind howling with unnatural force. Marcus moved to the window, staring out toward the harbor where the siren's call now glowed with an ethereal blue-green light that pulsed in rhythm with the medallion pieces in his pocket. "We're running out of time," he said quietly, "and I think I know who the sacrifice has to be." Dawn brought no relief to Port Haven. The storm had transformed into something meteorologists struggled to classify, a stationary system centered precisely over the harbor, with wind patterns that defied natural explanation. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, and an evacuation order was issued for low-lying areas, as the sea rose well beyond predicted tide levels. Marcus stood in Miss Patterson's kitchen, reviewing the ritual instructions she had transcribed from the family records. The components were dauntingly specific: the complete heart of the siren, a blood offering from Drake's lineage, and a ceremonial dagger used in the original binding ritual. According to Thomas Blackwood's notes, Drake hid the dagger in a cave system along the northern coastline, Patterson explained, unfolding a weathered map, a place the local indigenous people considered sacred or forbidden depending on the translation. Widow's Peak. James recognized the location. Those caves flood completely at high tide, which is why Drake chose it. Miss Patterson nodded. Accessible only briefly during the lowest tides of the year. Marcus checked the tide charts on his phone. Low tide is at 2:15 this afternoon. That gives us a narrow window to retrieve the dagger before the eclipse tonight. "I'm coming with you," James insisted. "We all are," Ellie added, her camera equipment already packed in a waterproof bag. Hargrove had retreated to make preparations for his version of the ritual, unaware of their alternative plan. They would let him believe they were cooperating until the crucial moment when they could secure all three pieces of the heart. The drive to Widow's Peak was tense, the coastal road partially flooded in sections. James's truck forged through shallow water that shouldn't have been there, even during the worst storms. In the distance, unnatural lightning forked across the sky, concentrating over the siren's call. The entity is manifesting aspects of itself already, Miss Patterson observed, manipulating weather patterns, influencing tidal forces. Can it see us? Ellie asked hesitantly. Know what we're planning? Not specifically, Miss Patterson replied, but it can sense intent, particularly from those connected to it by blood. She glanced meaningfully at Marcus. The sensation of being watched had grown stronger since dawn. Marcus felt a constant pressure at the edges of his mind, like whispers just below the threshold of hearing. The cut on his palm, the one that had appeared mysteriously after his first visit to the ship, now pulsed with the same blue-green glow as the medallion pieces. Widow's Peak loomed ahead, a jagged promontory jutting into the churning Atlantic. At its base, revealed only during the lowest tides, a series of cave entrances pierced the weathered granite. We have about 40 minutes before the tide turns, James warned, consulting his watch as they picked their way down the treacherous path to the beach. The caves were numerous, their openings like gaping mouths in the cliff face. Miss Patterson consulted her map. The third opening from the north, she directed. Look for a symbol carved above the entrance, 3 wavy lines intersected by a vertical spike. They found it partially submerged despite the low tide, requiring them to wade through knee-deep water. Inside, the cave narrowed quickly, forcing them to proceed in single file. Their flashlight beams revealed walls covered in unusual markings, not indigenous petroglyphs, as one might expect, but symbols similar to those on the medallion pieces. Drake wasn't the first to discover the entity, Miss Patterson explained, her voice echoing in the confined space. These markings suggest knowledge of it dates back thousands of years. The passage opened into a larger chamber where the floor rose above the water level. At its center stood a stone altar, crude but unmistakable in purpose. People were sacrificed here, Ellie whispered, her camera forgotten at her side. Not by Drake, Miss Patterson clarified. These stains are centuries older. The indigenous people were containing the entity long before Europeans arrived. James approached the altar cautiously, running his hand along its rough surface until he found a small crevice. There's something here. With effort he extracted a metal box encrusted with mineral deposits. The lock had long since corroded away, allowing them to pry it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the damp conditions, lay a dagger unlike any they had seen. Its blade was an iridescent material that wasn't quite metal, with a bone handle carved with the now familiar symbols. When Marcus's flashlight struck it, the blade seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The ritual dagger, Miss Patterson confirmed, forged from a material the entity cannot corrupt or control. As Marcus reached for it, a deep rumble shook the cave. Small stones and debris rained down from the ceiling. Earthquake, Ellie suggested hopefully. No, Marcus replied, his voice distant. The pressure in his mind had intensified, forming into coherent thought. It knows. It's trying to stop us. A surge of water rushed into the cave, far too soon for the turning tide. James grabbed the dagger and shoved it into his jacket. Out, now, he shouted as water rose rapidly around them. They fought their way back through the passage, now waist-deep in churning seawater. The cave entrance was barely visible ahead when Marcus heard his grandfather's voice behind him. Impossible, given Eddie was still in the hospital. Stay, boy, the voice urged with unnatural resonance. Your rightful place is with the ship. Marcus, move, Ellie screamed, grabbing his arm as he hesitated. They burst from the cave entrance into chaos. The previously clear sky had turned an ominous green-black directly above them. The sea churned with bioluminescent organisms that shouldn't have been present in these waters, creating patterns too organized to be natural. As they scrambled up the path to higher ground, a massive wave crashed against the cliff face, sending spray 50 feet into the air. In that spray, for the briefest moment, all of them clearly saw a face formed in the water, a face with Drake's features, but eyes that glowed with ancient malevolence. "The hospital," Marcus gasped as they reached the truck. "We need to check on Grandpa. The entity might target him next." They arrived to find Eddie's room empty, his bed neatly made as if he had never been there. Patient Blackwood checked himself out against medical advice approximately 2 hours ago, the nurse informed them, checking her records. A colleague drove him to the harbor at his insistence, something about needing to face old ghosts before the storm worsened. The harbor was eerily deserted when they arrived, evacuation orders having cleared the area of all but emergency personnel. Police barricades blocked the main access road, but James knew alternative routes through the old cannery district. The siren's call dominated the view, now completely restored to its 19th century glory. The vessel no longer appeared to be floating normally. It hovered several inches above the water's surface, surrounded by a nimbus of blue-green light that pulsed in rhythm with the approaching eclipse. There, Ellie pointed toward a solitary figure standing on the abandoned pier. Eddie Blackwood, impossibly steady despite his recent hospitalization, staring at the ship with unnatural focus. "Grandpa," Marcus called, rushing toward him with the others close behind. Eddie turned slowly, his eyes momentarily flashing with the same blue-green light as the medallions. "Marcus, you've brought the final components." His voice carried the same resonant quality Marcus had heard in the cave, layered with something ancient and inhuman. "That's not entirely your grandfather," Miss Patterson warned quietly. "The entity is speaking through him." "Fighting it," Eddie corrected, his voice briefly returning to normal as he struggled visibly. "Not much time. It's been calling to me since you removed the first piece." He gripped Marcus's arm with surprising strength. "Hargrove is already aboard. He plans to complete his ritual at the moment of totality." "How did he get past the police barricade?" James demanded. "He's been preparing for decades," Eddie replied, "and he has help now. The entity is serving his purpose temporarily, knowing his ritual will ultimately free it." "We need to get on that ship," Marcus said, the 2 medallion pieces in his pocket burning against his thigh. "I can help with that," Eddie nodded toward a small rowboat tied beneath the pier. "The entity will allow me to approach. It believes I'm coming to surrender myself as a vessel." "You can't," James protested. "Your heart is already failing," Eddie finished grimly. "But I can give you time to implement our plan." The lunar eclipse had begun, the moon's edge darkening as it entered Earth's shadow. They had less than 30 minutes until totality. As they rowed toward the siren's call, the water around them churned with unnatural life. Fish swimming in perfect geometric patterns, bioluminescent creatures pulsing in sync with the ship's glow. Marcus trailed his fingers in the water, feeling not wetness, but a curious energy that tingled up his arm. "It's no longer entirely in our reality," Miss Patterson observed. "The boundary between dimensions is thinning." Boarding proved unexpectedly easy. A rope ladder hung from the rail, as if awaiting their arrival. Once on deck, the transformation was even more apparent. Every surface gleamed with new varnish, every rope and sail perfectly maintained. Most disturbing were the ghostly crew members who moved about their duties, becoming more substantial with each passing minute. They ignored the newcomers completely, their eyes fixed on tasks from 2 centuries earlier. "Their echoes," Miss Patterson explained, "moments of time repeating as the ship reverts to the night of Drake's ritual." "Where would Hargrove be?" Marcus asked his grandfather. "The captain's quarters," Eddie replied, his voice fading in and out of that unnatural resonance. "Drake performed the original ritual there. The symbols are permanently embedded in the wood." They descended carefully, the ship's interior reconfigured into a labyrinthine structure that seemed to shift subtly when not directly observed. Passages ended abruptly in solid walls where doors had been moments before, while new corridors opened unexpectedly. "It's defending him," Ellie realized as they encountered yet another dead end. changing to keep us away from Hargrove. A violent lurch sent them stumbling as the ship fully detached from the water, now hovering several feet above the harbor's surface. Through the portholes, they could see the eclipse progressing, nearly half the moon now darkened. "We need to split up," Marcus decided. "Dad and Patterson try to reach the hold. Ellie and I will go for the captain's quarters." Grandpa, but Eddie was gone, vanished in the moment they'd been distracted by the ship's movement. Marcus and Ellie fought their way toward the stern, the medallion pieces guiding them with increasing warmth as they approached their counterpart. The captain's cabin door stood ajar, golden lamplight spilling into the corridor. Inside, Professor Hargrove had transformed the space into a ritual chamber. The desk had been pushed aside to reveal intricate symbols carved into the floor. At the center stood a complex apparatus, part scientific instrument, part occult construct, with 3 recesses clearly designed to hold the heart pieces. Hargrove himself knelt before the apparatus, the 3rd medallion piece resting in one recess. His formerly composed demeanor had abandoned him, his hair wild and eyes feverish as he recited an incantation in a language that hurt Marcus's ears. Behind him, visible only as a distortion in the air, something massive was taking shape, a suggestion of limbs and appendages that followed no terrestrial anatomy. "The final guest arrives," Hargrove smiled without looking up. "And bearing the missing pieces, I trust." "This won't work," Marcus warned, the medallion's now almost too hot to touch in his pocket. "You can't control it. Such limited thinking," Hargrove chided. "Not control, partnership. It needs a vessel. I need its knowledge, a perfect symbiosis." A scream echoed from somewhere below decks. Ellie's voice. "Your friends are encountering aspects of our guest," Hargrove explained casually. "Nothing personal. It simply doesn't want to be re-imprisoned." The eclipse approached. Totality. The moon now 3/4 covered. Through the cabin windows, Marcus could see Port Haven's lights in the distance, the town oblivious to the dimensional breach forming in their harbor. "The pieces, Marcus." Hargrove extended his hand, willingly offered or taken by force. "It makes no difference now." The air in the captain's quarters thickened, as the distortion behind Hargrove pulsed in rhythm with the advancing eclipse. Marcus could feel the medallion pieces burning in his pocket, straining toward their counterpart like powerful magnets. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Marcus insisted, backing toward the door. "This isn't some benevolent entity seeking partnership. It wants to consume everything." "Spoken like a true Blackwood," Hargrove sneered. "Always hiding from power instead of embracing it." Drake saw the potential before his resolve weakened. Another scream echoed through the ship, closer this time. Marcus lunged for the door, only to find it suddenly sealed, the wood grain seamlessly merged with the frame. "I told you," Hargrove said almost apologetically. "The ship obeys me now, or rather it obeys the presence that's manifesting. I'm merely its favorite at the moment." The distortion behind him expanded, tendrils of something not quite solid and not quite gaseous extending into the room where they passed. Reality itself seemed to warp, objects and shadows twisting in ways that defied natural geometry. "What you're seeing is merely the smallest fraction of its true form," Hargrove explained, his voice reverent. "A multidimensional being experiencing our reality through the filter of the heart. At the moment of totality, the alignment will allow more of it to manifest." A tremendous crash shook the ship as something heavy fell overhead. The distortion rippled with what might have been alarm. "Your grandfather is making a nuisance of himself," Hargrove frowned. "He's accessed the ship's bell." Marcus remembered Miss Patterson's research. The ship's bell could summon or banish the ghostly crew. If Eddie had reached, as if confirming his thoughts, the haunting toll of a bronze bell reverberated through the vessel. The ghostly crew members, previously engaged in their mindless routines, suddenly froze. As the bell rang a second time, their spectral forms solidified further, but their vacant expressions changed, awareness returning to their eyes. "No," Hargrove shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Not yet. The alignment isn't complete. The third toll transformed the crew entirely. They were still clearly not human, their forms translucent, their movements accompanied by echoes of sea spray and wind, but their eyes now held purpose. Several turned toward the captain's quarters, expressions hardening with recognition. Drake is controlling them, Marcus realized. Some part of him still exists within the ship. The door behind him splintered as ghostly hands tore through the wood. The spectral crew poured into the room, moving with singular purpose toward Hargrove and the manifestation behind him. In the confusion, Marcus spotted Ellie being dragged into the room by what appeared to be tentacles of living shadow. Her eyes were wide with terror, her camera still clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Marcus," she gasped, "it's showing me things, civilizations underwater, cities built by things that aren't human." Marcus lunged toward her, but a wall of ghostly sailors blocked his path, engaged in combat with the shadow tentacles. The ship lurched violently, throwing everyone off balance as it rose higher above the harbor. Through the windows, Marcus could see the eclipse nearing totality, barely a sliver of moonlight remaining. The air crackled with energy as the distortion behind Hargrove expanded further, beginning to take a more definite shape. What emerged was beyond comprehension, a mass of writhing appendages surrounding a central body that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. Parts of it remained invisible to human eyes, recognizable only by the way space distorted around its unseen mass. What could be seen resembled nothing on Earth. A nightmarish amalgamation of marine life evolved along entirely different lines. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were the only familiar feature, glowing with the same blue-green light as the medallions, identical to what Marcus had seen in Drake's apparition. The heart, it spoke directly into Marcus's mind, the words bypassing his ears entirely. "Complete the heart." Hargrove stood transfixed, arms outstretched toward the manifestation in rapturous welcome. "Yes, come through. I am your vessel, your partner in this world." The entity's attention shifted briefly to Hargrove, a tendril extending to caress his face almost tenderly. Then, with a motion too fast to follow, it plunged into his mouth, nose and eyes. Hargrove's body convulsed, his back arching unnaturally as the entity poured itself into him. When he straightened, his eyes glowed with that now familiar light, his movements jerky and uncoordinated like a puppet with new strings. "This vessel is inadequate," Hargrove's voice emerged, layered with ancient, inhuman tones. "Blackwood blood is required." The lineage, prepared by Drake, it turned Hargrove's head toward Marcus, with a sickening crack of vertebrae. "You," it said simply. The medallion pieces burned white-hot in Marcus's pocket. Acting on instinct, he pulled them out and slammed them together in his palm. Instead of burning him, they fused instantly, the metal flowing like liquid to join into a single piece. In the same moment, the third piece tore itself free from Hargrove's apparatus and flew across the room, completing the heart in Marcus's hand. The completed medallion pulsed with blinding light. Marcus felt a surge of connection to the ship, to Drake's lingering consciousness, and to the entity itself. Knowledge flooded his mind, the ritual, its purpose, and what would happen if it succeeded. "The bell," he shouted to the ghostly crew. "Get Ellie to the bell." As two spectral sailors pulled Ellie free from the shadow tentacles, Marcus raised the completed heart toward the eclipse, now reaching totality outside the window. "I am of Drake's blood," he announced, his voice carrying the same resonance as the entity's, "and I claim the right of binding." The completed heart pulsed with power in Marcus's palm, neither burning nor cold, but vibrating with energy that seemed to flow directly into his bloodstream. Knowledge that wasn't his own flooded his consciousness, alien geometries, impossible mathematics, and the precise ritual needed to bind the entity. Hargrove's possessed body lurched toward him, movements jerky yet frighteningly fast. "You cannot bind what is already free." The entity spoke through his lips, voice layered with inhuman harmonics. "Drake's seal has broken. The alignment is complete." Outside the windows, the eclipse reached totality, the corona of the sun forming a perfect ring around the black disk of the moon. The ship rose higher above Port Haven, now suspended nearly 30 feet above the harbor waters. The dagger, Marcus called to his father, who had just fought his way into the cabin alongside Miss Patterson. "I need the binding dagger." James pulled the ancient weapon from his jacket, its strange blade absorbing rather than reflecting the otherworldly light, filling the cabin. He tossed it to Marcus, who caught it by the bone handle. "You'll need to complete the bloodline connection," Patterson instructed, her academic calm somehow intact, despite the chaos. "The ritual requires—" "I know what it requires," Marcus interrupted, the alien knowledge clear in his mind. "Everyone get off the ship. Now." "We're not leaving you," Ellie protested, now free from the shadow tentacles thanks to Drake's spectral crew. "The binding will sink the vessel," Marcus explained, positioning himself between his friends and the possessed Hargrove. "It's returning to its prison beneath the ocean. Anyone aboard will go with it." "There must be another way," James insisted. The entity surged partially out of Hargrove's body, shadow-like appendages whipping around the cabin with increasing solidity. One tentacle shattered a window, letting in the eclipse's eerie light. "There isn't time," Marcus urged. "The longer the totality lasts, the more of it manifests. Once it's fully here, nothing can send it back." Eddie appeared in the doorway, his appearance shocking them all. His body seemed partially translucent, merging with the spectral nature of Drake's crew. The ship's bell hung from his grasp, still resonating with power. "The boy's right," Eddie's voice echoed with the same quality as the ghostly sailor's. "I've rung the binding toll. Drake's waiting to complete the cycle." Miss Patterson understood first. "You've already sacrificed yourself," she whispered to Eddie. "You've become part of the ship's spiritual matrix." Eddie nodded, his form flickering. "My heart gave out when I rang the third toll. Drake was waiting, offered me a choice." He looked at Marcus with profound sadness. "But the binding still needs Blackwood blood, living blood. The sacrifice must be freely given." Marcus gripped the dagger tighter, understanding flooding him. "It doesn't require death," he clarified for the others. "It requires dedication, a lifetime commitment to maintaining the seal." "No," James stepped forward. "Take me instead. I'm of the same bloodline." "It won't work," Eddie shook his translucent head. "The entity has already formed a connection with Marcus through the medallion. It has to be him." The possessed Hargrove shrieked, an inhuman sound that cracked the remaining windows. "Enough. The vessel is mine." The entity surged further from his body, more appendages materializing as it fought to fully enter their reality. "Go," Marcus ordered, brandishing the heart in one hand and the dagger in the other. "Dad, get them off the ship now." For a moment, James hesitated, the weight of generations of Blackwood responsibility visible in his eyes. Then he nodded once, grabbing Ellie's arm with one hand and Patterson's with the other. "I'll find you," Marcus promised as they retreated. "After it's done," the spectral form of Eddie remained. "I'll stay, help guide the ritual." His ghostly hand rested briefly on Marcus's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, boy." As the others fled, Marcus faced the entity. Hargrove's body had collapsed to the floor, twitching occasionally, but mostly abandoned. As the entity continued its manifestation, the air distorted around its true form, reality itself struggling to accommodate something that existed in more dimensions than humans could perceive. Marcus raised the completed heart, which now pulsed in perfect synchronization with his heartbeat. Following knowledge that wasn't his own, he began the incantation, words in no human lellings that nonetheless flowed from his lips as if he'd spoken them all his life. The entity recoiled, then surged forward in desperation. Marcus slashed his palm with the dagger, letting blood drip onto the heart. The medallion absorbed the crimson liquid, its engravings filling with blood that glowed with the same blue-green light. "By blood and binding, by sacrifice freely given," Marcus continued in English, the alien knowledge translating itself through him. "I take up the mantle of guardian. I am the anchor, the seal, the living lock." The ship groaned around them, timbers shifting as the entire structure began to transform. The entity shrieked in multiple frequencies simultaneously, some beyond human hearing that nonetheless made Marcus's bones vibrate. Through generations the watch continues. Marcus pressed the bloodied heart against his chest, directly over his own heart. What Drake began, I complete. What was broken, I restore. The heart began to sink into his flesh, not cutting but merging, becoming part of him. Pain beyond anything Marcus had experienced flooded his system as the entity fought against the binding with desperate strength. In that moment of agony, Marcus felt another presence join him. Captain Bartholomew Drake, 2 centuries dead, but preserved within the ship's spiritual matrix. Through him flowed the strength of all who had sacrificed to keep the entity contained. Together, Drake's voice echoed through Marcus's mind as the heart completed its merger with his flesh. The entity gave one final, reality-distorting shriek as the binding took hold. The ship lurched downward, beginning its return to the depths as the eclipse's totality began to wane. 3 days after the eclipse, Port Haven began its slow return to normalcy. The storm had dissipated with the entity's containment, leaving behind considerable damage, but no casualties. A miracle, according to news reports that struggled to explain the unprecedented meteorological anomaly that had affected only their small coastal town. The siren's call had vanished beneath the harbor waters during the eclipse, taking with it all evidence of the supernatural events that had transpired. Sonar surveys by the Coast Guard revealed nothing but natural seafloor topography, where the ship had been moored for decades, as if it had never existed. Professor Hargrove's body had washed ashore the following morning, medical examiners attributing his death to drowning despite the peculiar desiccation of his tissues that more resembled extreme mummification than typical drowning victims. Marcus stood at the harbor's edge, watching the sunset paint the calm water in hues of orange and gold. The heart of the siren was no longer visible on his chest, having fully merged with his body during the binding ritual, but he could feel it constantly, a slight pressure against his sternum that pulsed in rhythm with the tides. "How are you feeling?" Ellie asked, joining him at the railing. Her camera hung around her neck, but she hadn't taken many photos since that night. "Different," Marcus admitted. "Connected to things I can't quite explain." He gestured toward the harbor. "I can feel it down there, contained but aware, waiting. Miss Patterson says the binding should hold for at least another century," Ellie offered reassuringly. "Longer, since you completed the proper ritual instead of Drake's temporary version." Marcus nodded, though the knowledge transferred during the binding had shown him the truth. No imprisonment was permanent. The entity was patient, existing on a timescale where centuries passed, like moments. It would wait, conserving strength, testing the boundaries of its prison. James approached from the harbor master's office, where he'd been helping coordinate cleanup efforts. The events had transformed him as well, his lifelong skepticism replaced by a grim acceptance of his family's legacy. "Memorial service for Dad is tomorrow," he said quietly, joining them at the railing. Ms. Patterson helped arrange a proper Blackwood Guardian ceremony. Small, private. Though Eddie's body had been recovered from the hospital where he'd been officially pronounced dead from heart failure, they all knew his spirit remained with the ship, part of the complex metaphysical matrix that helped maintain the binding. In quiet moments, Marcus could sometimes hear his grandfather's voice, alongside Captain Drake's and others who had sacrificed over the centuries. "I've been thinking about what happens next," Marcus said, turning to face his father. "About our family's responsibility." James nodded solemnly. "Miss Patterson shared the Blackwood journals with me. Each generation needs a dedicated guardian to monitor the binding, perform the maintenance rituals. That's me now." Marcus touched his chest where the heart resided. "But we need to be better prepared than previous generations. The knowledge can't be lost again." Later that evening, they gathered in Miss Patterson's cottage. The dining table was covered with the accumulated research of generations of Blackwoods, along with Hargrove's materials recovered from his hotel room. "I've spoken with the town council," Miss Patterson announced. "We're establishing a special collection in the archives, officially for historical maritime research, but actually to preserve everything we know about the entity and the binding rituals. I want to document everything while it's fresh in my mind," Marcus said, opening a new leather-bound journal, embossed with the Blackwood family crest. "Everything the heart showed me during the binding, everything I learned from Drake's consciousness, and I'll help translate the technical aspects," Ellie added. Her experiences with the entity had left her with unexpected insights into its nature, glimpses of knowledge from civilizations that had encountered it before humans evolved. "What about college?" James asked gently. "Your plans for marine biology?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Still happening, just with a more specific focus now. And I need to stay near the coast, near the binding site. The rituals require physical proximity at certain astronomical alignment." The binding had changed him in ways still revealing themselves. His connection to the sea had deepened. He could sense currents and weather patterns before instruments detected them, could sometimes hear whispers of ocean creatures communicating in ways science hadn't yet documented. A week later they held a proper memorial for Eddie at the shoreline. As tradition dictated for Blackwood guardians, they cast a wreath of specific flowers and herbs into the outgoing tide, along with a small model ship containing personal mementos. Marcus stood at the water's edge longer than the others, watching the wreath drift toward the spot where the siren's call had returned to the depth. For just a moment, as the last light of day faded, he thought he saw a ghostly figure standing on the water's surface. Eddie, looking younger and stronger than he had in life, raising a hand in solemn farewell before dissolving into sea spray. That night, Marcus completed the first entry in the new Guardian's journal, recording everything about the binding ritual, the nature of the entity, and the responsibility now passed to him. Future generations of Blackwoods would not face this burden unprepared as he had. On the journal's first page, he wrote a simple dedication: "For Eddie Blackwood, who showed me that our greatest legacy is the sacrifices we make for others." 1 year later, Marcus stood on the Port Haven Lighthouse observation deck, gazing out at the harbor where life had returned to normal. Fishing boats bobbed in the gentle swells, tourists wandered the revitalized waterfront shops, and children played along the shoreline, blissfully unaware of what lay dormant beneath the seemingly ordinary waters. The anniversary of the binding ritual had arrived with the spring equinox, requiring Marcus to perform the first of many maintenance ceremonies that would mark his life going forward. The small circular scar on his chest, where the heart had merged with his flesh, tingled in anticipation, sensing the approach of the celestial alignment. "Ready for tonight?" Ellie asked, joining him at the railing. She'd delayed her college plans to stay in Port Haven with Marcus, documenting the aftermath and helping translate the knowledge that still occasionally surfaced from his connection to the entity. "As ready as I can be," he nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that had aged him well beyond his 18 years. The maintenance ritual was simpler than the original binding, but no less important: a renewal of the blood contract, an affirmation of the Guardian's commitment. Without it, the entity would begin testing its boundaries, sending ripples of influence into the world above. "Dad's prepared the boat," Marcus said. "Miss Patterson found the exact coordinates in the Blackwood archives. They had spent the year strengthening the town's defenses against any future awakening." The Maritime Museum now secretly housed monitoring equipment disguised as historical displays. Certain members of the town council had been cautiously briefed about Port Haven's true history, ensuring future generations would not dismiss the Blackwood warnings as mere superstition. That evening, as twilight settled over the coast, Marcus stood at the bow of his father's fishing boat as it idled above the spot where the siren's call had returned to the depths. The water here was unnaturally still, forming a perfect circle of calm amid the harbor's gentle waves. James cut the engine, and silence enveloped them. "We'll keep watch," he promised, retreating to the stern with Ellie and Miss Patterson, giving Marcus the privacy required for the ritual. Drawing the ceremonial dagger, the same one used during the original binding, Marcus felt the presence of those who had come before. Eddie's consciousness brushed against his mind, along with Captain Drake's and others, stretching back centuries, guardians all, their vigilance continuing beyond death. "I renew the covenant," Marcus whispered, drawing the blade across his palm. As blood welled from the shallow cut, the scar on his chest pulsed with blue-green light visible even through his shirt. He let 3 drops fall into the water below. The moment they touched the surface, they expanded into perfect circles that glowed with the same unearthly light as the heart. The circles descended rather than dissipated, carrying Marcus's blood offering down to the imprisoned entity. For a brief, terrifying moment, Marcus felt it respond, ancient awareness turning its attention upward, recognizing the blood that bound it. Images flooded his mind. Civilizers beneath lightless seas, technologies beyond human comprehension, and promises of power if he would only relax the binding slightly. "No," Marcus stated firmly, his will reinforced by the generations of guardians, whose essence remained in the spiritual matrix. "The terms remain unchanged. The binding holds." A sense of frustrated acknowledgement emanated from below, followed by reluctant withdrawal. The entity would honor the binding for another year, conserving its strength for the long game it played across centuries. As Marcus completed the ritual, he noticed something troubling, a small fragment of the heart, no larger than a grain of rice, floating on the water's surface instead of descending with his blood. Before he could react, it skittered across the waves like a water strider, disappearing into the darkness beyond the boat's lights. The implications chilled him. A fragment meant an imperfection in the binding, a tiny opening that could, over time, allow threads of the entity's influence to seep into the world. Not enough for escape or manifestation, but enough to touch receptive minds, to whisper in dreams, to seek new allies. "Everything okay?" James called from the stern, noticing Marcus's troubled expression. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "The binding is renewed," he answered truthfully, if incompletely. The fragment was concerning but not an immediate threat. He would document it in the Guardian's journal and watch for any signs of the entity's influence manifesting in Port Haven. Later that night, Marcus added a new entry to the journal, detailing both the successful ritual and his concerns about the fragment. The book had grown thick with daily observations over the past year, changes in local marine life, unusual weather patterns, dreams that might be his own, or might be sent by the entity testing its prison. On his desk sat a nautical chart of the eastern seaboard, with Port Haven at its center. Small red pins marked locations where unusual maritime incidents had been reported over the past year. Nothing conclusive, but a pattern worth monitoring. As he prepared for bed, Marcus caught his reflection in the mirror. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. His eyes occasionally shifted in certain lights, flashing with hints of that now familiar blue-green glow. His connection to the sea had deepened further. He could sense storms days before meteorologists, could sometimes hear whales conversing hundreds of miles offshore. He was no longer fully human, but neither was he a vessel for the entity. He existed at the boundary, guardian and gatekeeper. His lifespan likely extended far beyond normal years by his merger with the heart. "The watch continues," Marcus whispered to his reflection, echoing the words generations of Blackwoods had spoken before him. "What sleeps below must never awaken." Outside his window, the sea whispered back, patient and eternal, carrying the entity's silent promise. What is bound may eventually break, and when it does, the sea will reclaim its own.